This morning's scripture reading is from Joshua, chapter 3, verses 7 through 17. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. You are the one who shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant. When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." Joshua then said to the Israelites, "Draw near and hear the words of the Lord your God." Joshua said, "By this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and the Jebusites. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is going to pass before you into the Jordan. So now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. When the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off. They shall stand in a single heap. When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests, bearing the ark of the covenant, were in front of the people. Now, the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of the harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap, far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing towards the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan.
Hope everybody had fun last night. Sorry I missed it. I heard there was a little gambling going on. A little raffle, huh? That's good, that's good. You know, since I missed that, I wanted to put a wager down today. I don't know if anybody's willing to take this or not, but I want to wager that the Bears don't lose today. I know it's unusual. They usually do lose, but for some reason I have great confidence they're not going to lose today. Anybody want to take me up on that? Yeah, something like, wait, what's the trick here? They haven't played me. Our New Testament reading is from Matthew chapter 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." Ignazio Loyola. He was described by many as somebody who always had this great desire for fame. He wanted to be famous, especially for his military conquests. He studied at that time, back in the 1600s, what would have been similar to, in Spain, as martial arts, He studied the fighting arts. He studied how to use weapons, how to wear the gear, the military gear of the times, to be a great fighter, and to defeat anybody who came across his path. In fact, one time he got into an argument with a guy who was saying that Jesus wasn't divine. And so Ignacio says, well, yes, he was. In fact, I'll prove it to you. We're going to have a duel. Now, how that proves anything, I have no idea. But he won the duel and killed the man. And that was his life. He wanted people to know that he was a bad dude, and he was not to be messed with. Well, in one of the battles that he had, he was struck by a cannonball in the leg. Can you imagine that? Wiped out his leg, as you can figure, snapped it, and injured the other leg as it passed through this one. And so, as he was laying there in that hospital bed, getting his legs put back together, and now, obviously there's no metal screws, there's no anesthetics at this time. Must have been a horribly painful experience, but he had a lot of time to reflect on life as he lay there in that bed. And some people would bring him books, kind of like we do today. And because most of the hospitals were run back then, kind of like today too, by the Catholic Church, there was a book by the side of the bed called The Life of Christ. And so in his boredom, he picked it up and he started reading it. And it told about all of the saints past and of all of the apostles. And he learned a lot about them and started to develop this feeling of closeness with the 12 disciples and those who came after. And he was somehow transformed as he lay there reading that book. He began to pray more often. He began to think of things that were spiritual. And finally, when he was well enough to leave, he went to a Benedictine monastery, and he took his military garments, his vestments, his gear, and he laid it before a statue of the Virgin Mary and swore to give up fighting and that he would turn his life to spiritual things. And so then he went off to a cave where for many months he prayed for 7 hours a day, trying to cleanse his soul, trying to become at one with God, trying to get rid of his human ambitions of fame and perhaps even fortune. Because he came from a good family, so it was only right that he should want to continue that lineage. But in his prayers, he developed these practices, these spiritual practices that he found through contemplation, through this vision of imagining himself with the disciples in the accounts that were described about them in the Gospels. And so this contemplative practice was developed. In fact, he wrote a book, the 200 spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. Today is yesterday was All Saints' Day. Today is All Souls' Day. And so we remember those people who found it within themselves to give up enough of themselves, or what they perceived as themselves, to become something greater than that which they could have imagined on their own. This man, as we know today, is Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who was made a saint in 1622, realized that the life that he was living, the path that he was on, was full of ambition in his own mind and in his own heart, but that just wasn't good enough, because he was made for a greater purpose. And until he embraced that, he realized that he really wouldn't be living. He might be alive, but he wouldn't be living until he embraced that which was truly him, the purposes that God had for him. It takes a lot of courage to do that. It takes a lot of courage to be honest with yourself, to be honest with others, to not say what others want us to hear, right? When somebody asks us something and we want to give the answer that puts us in the best light, that makes us look good, that makes us look special in some way. I'll give you a funny example. Right up there, Selah and I like to come in here and play in the sanctuary. She always says, "Church, church." So we come over here, we play in the nursery, and we make our way to the sanctuary. And on Wednesday, we're sitting right here, and she looks up at that picture up there, and she says, "Daddy." And I'm like, well, we both got brown eyes and a beard, but that's about the end of it. I had to admit to her that, no, that's not me. And I hope nobody ever nails me to a cross, because that would really ruin my day. But it takes courage to admit these things. And that, interestingly enough, is who the court jesters were back in medieval times. These people were deemed as crazy. And that's why they became court jesters, because they didn't care what the consequences were when they went and told the king some news that maybe the king didn't want to hear. Like maybe somebody was invading in one part of the kingdom, or maybe your defenses weren't as strong as you thought they were, or perhaps your finances weren't quite in order as you thought they were. And so the jesters, being crazy enough to look at the king in the face and say, guess what, dude? Something's wrong. Because everybody else wouldn't do it. They were afraid it would be off with your head. Right? Tell the king something he doesn't want to hear, and guess what? You might be right, but he might also pay for it. And that's who the court jesters were. And then comes Joshua into the story. Joshua, if you'll remember, was picked by Moses. Really picked by God. Said, hey, here's the guy that you're looking for. The guy that I'm looking for. And you're going to have to go to him and call him. Kind of like Elijah did with Elisha when he knew that his time was up. It was the same thing with Moses. Moses had a purpose, and that was to bring the people out of slavery, out of Egypt, to live lives that were not about bondage, to live lives that were about freedom. But guess what? He brings them out into the desert, and what happens? They complain, they bicker, they moan. We're thirsty. Why'd you bring us out here to die? We're hungry. Why are you going to let us starve to death? This flaky stuff, I'm tired of it. It's nasty. It's like probably instant cream of wheat or something like that, or grits, or I don't know. Imagine eating that every day. It's okay once in a while, but it gets old. Right? We want some meat. You never once hear about these people taking the initiative and living with intentionality. They just wander. They wander aimlessly for 40 years, and Moses couldn't bring them together to find a real purpose, to discover their calling so that he could lead them into the promised land. So you can think of the promised land as something literal, an actual place, or we can think of it as something figurative. A place, maybe this allegorical creation that exists for all of us. This place that we always have in sight, even if we don't recognize it. Something, some place that we're always aspiring to, some place that we're always headed for, but sometimes we get derailed. We get sidetracked. We find that it wasn't Moses' calling to take them to the promised land. Maybe he was supposed to initially. Maybe he just dropped the ball. Maybe he got scared. Maybe he got tired of people complaining to him all the time and said, I give up. Because there were lots of times he wanted to give up. And I would argue that in the end he did give up. But then Joshua comes along. And God says, your time has come. That to which I have called you, the moment has come now. And you will stand and command the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant, one from each tribe, carrying God. They believed God was in this ark. Carrying God into the waters. And what happens? The water parts. And we just heard that not too long ago, right? Moses did the same thing. Cross what was supposedly a sea, and Joshua does it to this little tiny, really almost a stream. It's not that big of a river. But nonetheless, he knows that his moment has come, and he has the courage to tell these people, just trust me on this. Trust me on this. Because now, we're not going to wander anymore. We're not going to go around aimlessly trying to figure out what we're supposed to do here on this earth. No, we are going to take the initiative. We are going to be intentional about our lives, and we are going to stand with the faith and the courage and the determination that when we set out across this water, that nothing is going to get in our way. And so they did. Now, I'm sure in the lectionary scriptures will be coming up about a lot of things that got in their way once they got over it, but there's a huge difference. We may disagree with all the blood and the gore and the violence that's about to come in Canaan, in the scriptures to come. But one thing we can say about the Israelites, they found it. Whatever it was, they found it. Because they start being intentional. They make plans. They do them. They commit to the action. And then what happens? They defeat everybody that comes in their way. It's hard to look at the Old Testament because it does just look like this big gory mess of this vindictive God who commands the Israelites to kill everybody in their path because this land I have given you, thus you do what you need to get it. That's one way to read it. But I'm not sure that that's the only way. I don't think we need to even see these people as literal. We can see them as obstacles. There's always two ways to read the Bible, right? See them as obstacles. The obstacles that we usually set up before us in our lives. And Jesus pointed that out. When he was teaching the disciples and saying that these Sadducees, these Pharisees, and these scribes, they talk a good game. They say a lot of good stuff because they stand at the seat of Moses. So listen to them. But don't do what they do. Because they create this high bar and they don't live up to it. But boy, if you don't live up to it, they'll be on you like white on rice. And that's how they lived. They wore their phylacteries, which is a little box containing a piece of the Torah, on their arms. They wore their fringes. You can still see the fringes and tassels today if you walk down Devon, even down Peterson. They wore them, hey, look at me. Look at me, I'm a holy man. But they didn't do anything. They just talked. And Jesus says, the greatest one isn't going to be somebody who calls himself a rabbi, who says that he's a teacher, an instructor. No. The greatest is going to be the one who is a servant. Don't our minds right there automatically go to hierarchy? Right? The Lord and the servant. That's one way to look at it. And I think that's what he meant, but I think he meant something else that we tend to miss. What does the servant do? They do. Right? The lord of the castle, of the manor, of the estate, sits there and drinks tea and eats crumpets. The servants do. They go out there and they get their hands dirty. They get their feet wet. They freeze outside when it's cold out because there's still work to be done. They stand before a river that seems foreboding, that seems formidable, but they step into it anyway because they have faith. That something inside of them tells them that this obstacle is going to move out of my way if I just keep going. That's what Joshua was talking about. That's what Jesus was talking about. That if you keep going, no matter how difficult it looks, if you trust, if you have faith that something great is going to happen, but it doesn't mean that things always look the way we think they're going to when we get there. I imagine that when Jesus was telling this to the disciples, telling them not to listen to these holy men, I think we develop a voice in our head that sounds kind of condescending. Don't listen to these idiots. They talk a good game, but they don't do squat. I don't know. I don't know if that's how Jesus sounded. Because see, when I read the scriptures, I try to picture it. That Ignatian contemplation, right? I try to picture the way it's going. I try to hear the tone in their voices. And I'm imagining that perhaps Jesus sounded even a little sad, a little disappointed. These people, they sit at the seat of Moses. They were called to something great. But by their choice, they failed to act. They sit on their hands. They toot their own horns. They brag. They wear all the garb. But all they do is run their mouths and do nothing. I imagine Jesus is pretty sad and disappointed about that. Maybe he even had hope that somehow they would change. There was a Sufi mystic, a guru, named Nasruddin. And people would come from all over to hear him speak. I mean, he was like one of these wise people that just said stuff that would knock your socks off. And so this auditorium is full of 1,700 people. It seats 1,000. I'm sure they broke the fire code. Because you had 700 people just standing anywhere they could in the back and down out through the aisles and even outside watching through closed circuit television. He was supposed to come on at 2 o'clock. But 2 o'clock comes and goes and still no sign of Nasruddin. Somebody comes up to the stage and says, "We apologize, but the master is running a little late. Please have patience with us." And so 3 o'clock rolls along, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And people, each hour, each minute, are heading out the doors. They're ticked off. They go back to the box office. "Give me my money back. This is ridiculous." And so they leave. And then there's just maybe a few hundred people left by the time at 6 o'clock that he finally comes on the stage, stumbling, slurring his words because he's obviously very intoxicated. And there's this woman sitting up in the front row, attractive young lady, and he says, "You're pretty sexy. I want to take you to Paris with me. We'll have fun." Oh, were the people offended? Great master, the man who was supposed to be so wise and so great, saying this filth. So more people got up and left. Finally, there were 9 people left sitting in this huge auditorium where 1,700 people had just been gathered. And he stands up straight and speaks perfectly clearly, not a bit drunk, and says, You are the people that I'm coming to talk to today. He says, because you learned the 2 biggest things about the spiritual journey. He said the first is that you don't get that you have patience. The first is that you have patience to wait for your day to come. The second is that you're disappointed by what you find when you get there. A lot of people couldn't wait. I probably would have left too. I'm sure I would have. Right? But what does it take to persevere? What does it take to wait, to stay, to remain determined, to keep fighting, to keep going and holding on to some modicum of hope and expectation that something is going to be different if I just keep going? John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was often asked, how do you keep your faith? Do you believe everything that you say? And he said, no. I preach it until I believe it. I preach it until I believe it. But you know what? I think if we do it until we become it, that's the key. We're not always going to believe it. We're not always going to think that everything's going to turn out okay and that we're going to become the people who we were called to become, the people who we were made to be. But if we keep persevering, if we stand there on that riverbank, keep telling ourselves, when I put my foot in the water is going to move. And therefore, I'm going to do it. We need to live. We need to live intentionally. And even when we don't quite believe that it's going to work out, we have to do it until we become it.